Well, hello everyone, and happy Friday to you. I am Wendy Underhill, and I will be moderating today's webinar on census outreach. We do have some wonderful presenters with us here today, but before we get to those, I want to mention a couple of logistical items. First, there is a chat box in the lower right corner of your screen, and we encourage you to type questions or comments in there at any time. Those comments will be visible to everyone, just so you know. And to be sure that you're comfortable with that chat function and also to see who's on the line today, how about each of you type in your state or include your name if you'd like to. Let's see who we've got here today. I'm not seeing anything in here yet. Are people able to, why don't you go ahead and type in there and see if we can see how that's working. Okay, got it. Okay, South Carolina, Alaska, Oregon, Colorado. I recognize some names and of course all these states. Okay, great, it's working great. So when you have questions, you can go ahead and stick those in the chat box as well, and we will plan to answer those at the end of the presentations. If we can't get to all the questions, then we'll figure out some responses and send them out after the fact. I also want to point out that in addition to the chat box, we have a resources tab, and that's above the slides on the left. And in there, you'll find links to several resources from the presenters today, from NCSL, and from the U.S. Census Bureau. So check those things out. And if you have colleagues and friends who weren't able to join us today, please do know that this webinar will be recorded and will be available on NCSL's website early next week. And one last thing, if you're having technical problems, such as you can hear me but you don't see the text yet, go ahead and call 303-364-7700 and we'll see if we can help. Okay, on to the business at hand. This webinar is intended to address how states can get the word out about the importance of the 2020 census. Seems to me that if you're on this webinar as an attendee, you probably already know why the census is important, but I'll just say briefly that it's the basis for fair representation in our political institutions and also the fair distribution of money from the federal government to the states. And on that second point, well over $800 billion is distributed to states and local jurisdictions every year based on formulas that rely on good census data. Now, we know that the census is a federal undertaking, and also I can share that the feds are doing a great deal to encourage everyone to participate next year. Yes, by the way, it is coming up. It is less than a year away. But states realize that those federal efforts may not be enough. It's hard for a single national message to penetrate to all corners of every state. So we'll learn today what states are doing to complement or capitalize on those federal efforts. So now I'd like to advance my slides. Thank you. And it is time to introduce our presenters, Christy Zemarippa, Trent Sharp, and Latrice Bryant. Official bios for them can be found in the tab labeled Speakers, up next to the Resources tab. We'll hear first from NCSL's own Christy Zemarippa. She's been tracking state action related to census outreach on our webpage, 2020 Census Resources and Legislation. For today, she's going to have the overall high-level perspective on state commitments to census outreach. And then we'll hear from Trent Sharp, who works for American Institutes of Research, and I think of AIR as a nonprofit consulting group. NCSL came to Trent recently with another project idea, and he said, oh yeah, we could do that and that and that. That good attitude is much appreciated, I will say. Today, his role is to describe the ways states can do outreach to hard-to-count populations. And then we'll hear from Latrice Bryant, who is the director of Colorado's Complete Count Committee. From her, we'll get an on-the-ground view of her state's outreach efforts with some ideas that other states may want to borrow. Are you ready, Christy? Mm-hmm. Okay, all yours.
All right. Thanks, Wendy. Hello, everyone. My primary focus for this webinar will be on state-level complete count committees. A complete count committee or a complete count commission is a group that comes together to encourage everyone to participate in the census. Of course, people are legally required to respond, but that doesn't mean everyone does without a nudge. A great way to think about the census and its data is that it's a head count and not a survey. Now, during my talk, I will use committee as a shortened reference to a complete count committee. States can create their committees either through legislation, executive order, or other state action. Now, this is currently a map that shows those states with committees. First, committees enacted with through legislation. These states are in dark green on your map. Currently, 4 states have created committees through legislation, Illinois in 2017, Michigan, New Jersey, and New York in 2018. As we speak, 3 states have pending legislation: Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Texas. Now, a second way to establish a committee is through executive orders, and these states are colored in blue on this map. Governors in 20 states have used executive orders to create their committees. Georgia former Governor Nathan Deal was the first to establish a committee, and he did so in 2017. North Dakota's Governor Doug Burgum most recently established a committee earlier this month. Also shown in blue are Alaska, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Minnesota, Montana, and Utah. Now, these states use some other mechanism besides an executive order or legislation to create their committees. Now, by our records, there are 17 states that do not have a state-level committee so far. That doesn't mean that they aren't doing anything. It could be that the committee is in the process of being created, or one is in place but is run by nonprofits. Now, I'm going to briefly discuss appropriations. States might want to put funding into census outreach because it's expected to have a good return on investment in terms of federal funds that they can receive. As Wendy mentioned earlier, states want to get their fair share of the $880+ billion of federal funds. Earlier this week, I was listening to a talk on counting all children in 2020, and one statistic that stayed with me: there was an undercount of young kids in 2010, and as a result, states lost over $500 million a year, and this came from a total of 5 federal programs. Now, I have created 2 charts that show the funding that has been provided or asked for in the states, to the extent that we know of. The first chart represents those states with enacted and pending appropriations over $10 million: California, Illinois, New York, and Washington. California has put the most money towards the 2020 census with a little over $100 million so far, and the new governor, Gavin Newsom, is asking for $54 million in addition. Now, this second chart that is coming up represents 12 states with appropriations under $10 million. While not everyone has the same funding resources as California, a wide variety of funding has been enacted throughout the states. We are seeing appropriations in hundreds of thousands to several $million-dollar range in places such as Michigan, New Mexico, North Dakota, and Oregon. Now, the idea is that money spent now will help make sure the census is accurate, and it will pay dividends for a decade to come. So lastly, I'm going to briefly talk about what I have learned from specific committees. In Alabama, Kenneth Boswell, director of the Alabama Committee, was a business owner during the last census. He saw his town, Enterprise, was losing stores because they thought the town was losing population, even though he could see for himself that new developments were popping up around town. So as mayor, he gave speeches, he talked on the radio, he talked on TV, and he talked everywhere that they listened about the census and what it could do for that community. Now, getting the word out worked. The 2010 census numbers went up and the store stayed put. Now he is taking that same approach to the state level. Everyone can learn from others. In Washington, the state committee works with a number of groups: local jurisdictions, grassroots organizations, elected officials at all levels, including legislators, and anyone else who could help spread the word that the census is coming and why it matters. Finally, I'm going to mention Minnesota. For the first time, Minnesota has a full-time statewide committee. Andrew Verdon, the director, learned that Minneapolis in 2010 spent $100,000 of its own money to help with census outreach. The city saw an increase of 5%, and ultimately that $100,000 was a great investment for the city. Verdon also told me on the phone recently that if a state or other entities can't put cash on the barrelhead, then be resourceful for what you have available to you. Maybe dedicate staff to 10 hours, 20 hours a week to help with census outreach or other efforts. Anything helps. Now, just to sort of wrap up, we at NCSL are tracking state-level census outreach as best we can. Our webpage, 2020 Census, Legislation, and Resources, has much of what I shared today. Please let me know if we've missed something that's going on in your state. Thank you. Now I'll turn it back to Wendy.
Well, thank you, Christy. That was great. Now, we're going to turn to Trent Sharp in just a minute, but I first want to say that there's a phrase used in the census world, which is hard to count, or HTC communities. And this refers to our fellow Americans who aren't necessarily going to get the message that they must respond to the census and that it's easy to respond to the census. These are people in parts of rural America, people who move frequently, immigrants, young children apparently in particular, and a variety of other groups. Not surprisingly, most outreach then from the states is targeted at these people. And the American Institutes of Research, where Trent works, has developed a tool that makes it easier to figure out how to reach them. And with that, Trent, you are up.
All right, thank you, Wendy, and greetings, everyone. As I said, my name is Trent Sharp, and I'm a senior consultant at the American Institutes for Research, where I actually get to spend most of my time focusing on equity issues at the intersection between education, employment, health, housing, and transportation. But as Wendy and Christy kind of each highlighted, the census has real implications for each of these sectors. So I'm really glad to have an opportunity to share a bit about how I and a group of colleagues of I have been thinking about the opportunities and challenges related to the 2020 census. An appropriate place to start with looking forward to the 2020 census is really the 2010 census, and specifically the fact that the national mail return rate, which is how they get the census back, was a 75.8%. These return rates in other contexts would be stellar, and most survey and data scientists would love to get those sorts of results. But as you know, the implications for not getting a full count in the census are grander than most other surveys. So the U.S. Census Department's been really active about that, and they identified the census tracts nationally that were the hardest to count. They have defined hardest to count if a particular census tract had a self-response rate of less than 73%. So in other words, if people living in a particular census tract, so that's an area that's smaller than a zip code, if they did not answer their mail at a rate of less than 73%, they were considered hardest to count. And as you can see, these tracts are not equally distributed across the nation or even kind of within most states. And you'd be right to assume that there's a lot more going on than just answering one's mail here. Now, the Census Department certainly agreed, and actually in 2012 hosted a competition that was open globally where they asked contestants to find out which kind of demographic variables best predicted the non-response rates in the 2010 census. And based on the winners of that competition, they created what's called the low response score. And it's really based on the 25 variables that best explain variance in the 2010 return rate. So basically, if certain characteristics of demographic population exist with certain intensity in particular census tracts, then they are more likely not to respond. Some of the more influential variables are things like the percentage of renters living in a particular area, the percentage of people 18 to 24, or the percentage of households headed by unmarried females, particularly unmarried females with young children. More recently, the U.S. Census has released a great tool, which is called the Response Outreach AreaMapper, or ROAM. And this is, you see a link there below that you'll be able to access, but if you just type in U.S. Census ROAM, you'll be able to see that for yourself. And what it shows is the predicted non-response rate for the 2020 census. So as you can see in the map, the dark blue areas predict that the non-response rate will be somewhere in the ballpark of 30 to 49%. So it's a great tool, and one that's free and available to your state committees. And in addition to great tools, the Census has had a number of presentations just focused on this issue around low response scores and hard-to-count populations. And they've really presented a much more complex picture of folks and why they would be more likely to not respond. Some of the ways they've complicated that understanding are people that are just hard to locate. So maybe, as I believe the Alabama example mentioned, that the housing units weren't accurately counted, so that the people weren't actually counted, or people just want to remain hidden. Certain populations that are hard to contact, so they may be highly mobile or homeless, or perhaps there's physical barriers to reaching them. Some are just hard to interview, so there may be language barriers or low literacy, or perhaps lack of internet access for additional outreach areas. And then there's those who are just hard to persuade, so they may be, for their reasons, suspicious of the government or have other reasons that they have low civic participation. But the main takeaway for my colleagues and I, for sure, has been that the hard-to-count idea is far more complex than simple mail return rates, and that the needs are really cross-cutting, and frankly, that complete count committees are really going to need help, and particularly to help around a collective impact effort to address some of these issues in the state and really reach populations. In response, my colleagues and I have been grappling with how to translate the insights and the great resources that are available through the census into operationalizing a ground game for a complete count. So what you're seeing here is actually a screenshot of a tool we've been developing where we've taken the census's Roam tool and integrated it and begin to overlay additional data layers that might inform outreach efforts. So for example, what you see in front of you now is the overlay of school districts nationally. And from our perspective, school districts are places where with the harder to reach populations, that gives you a sense of the local leadership who you might engage to be able to go in and work more effectively with communities. Zooming in, you might overlay school points. So in many places, most places, public schools are the centers of communities. And so you can see in this close-up in New Mexico, which has actually the largest number of hard-to-count census tracts, that the darker blue census tracts, actually they're very rural and don't have schools in them, so that would suggest another approach is needed. But most of the census tracts that come in at the predicted 25 to 29% response rates have schools in the center of those census tracts, and those would be locations to potentially engage and communicate with those communities. To further inform the ground game and outreach efforts, one of the things we will need to know, especially for this census, is whether or not folks have broadband access or access to virtual content. And so we can add in layers that shows whether or not they have subscriptions in the places that are the hardest to reach. And again, that would inform our outreach and communication efforts. But I would close by really owning that this creating the tool and overlaying the data layers is really the easy part. We feel like it's very important to compile data from multiple sectors because, as Wendy and Christy both mentioned, multiple sectors are implicated. So compiling the data from those sectors feels important to build urgency and political will. But the real human element is the harder part and the more necessary part, and particularly around convening diverse stakeholders and local elders, local community leaders, and analyzing the complex data sets, sitting together and really co-interpreting the data, and based on that interpretation, working with the diverse stakeholder groups to commit to collective action. These are some technical assistance efforts and offerings my colleagues and I and AIR have been working on. And so if you're interested in talking some more about how we might be helpful to your state, we'd love to talk more about that. Again, my name is Trent Sharp, and if you're interested in chatting, here's my contact information. I believe you can get that elsewhere as well. And now I'm happy to hand it off to Reese Bryant, who's going to talk to us a bit about their ground game in Colorado.
Trent, thank you very much. Do you know if that Rome data is available based on legislative district, or is it just by county or jurisdictional boundaries?
I believe that it is currently listed at, so it's listed at census tract level, but I'd have to dig back in. I know that our tool has incorporated the legislative boundaries, but I need to get back into Rome and see if they've done that. But those are easy to integrate for sure.
Great. Okay, well, thank you. Thank you. We should know that at NCSL. All right, we're about to hand it over to Reese. And Reese, before you start talking, would you tell everybody how it is you got involved in the census with your own experience first?
Sure. My name is Reese Bryant. I am actually the Deputy Executive Director for the Colorado Department of Local Affairs, which we deal with several aspects of Colorado, including our housing group. We have a division of housing that focuses on affordable housing across Colorado regardless of income level. We also try to make sure that various individuals have stable and supportive housing for the remainder of their lives. We also focus a lot with our Division of Local Government on technical assistance, and so this makes the census an even more important piece for our particular division. We like to make sure that not only are people outside of the Front Range area counted, but we also want to make sure that they have the tools necessary. So when I first started my work, the first thing that I kind of focused on, having worked for the state for quite some time through a couple of different agencies, was how the funding really does impact the state as a whole. And so I think the one component that people miss on a regular basis is not we're just trying to figure out how many people are in Colorado, but actually we need to know how many people are here because of funding. And so when we talk about efforts across the state, you'll hear me continuously focus on the types of funding that we get, whether it be funding for education, whether it be funding for our roads. We've had a significant population increase. We've increased by about 537,000 people over the last year. And so that alone, you feel the tension in traffic, you feel the tension in communities. You also have seen the price and cost of living increasing on a regular basis, just in Denver, but also outside in other areas across the state. So that's where the first component of my interest really started. The other piece of information that I want you guys to be aware of is that the efforts for Colorado is really a four-part series. We've got the federal component where we're constantly engaging with the U.S. Census Bureau. We're always making sure that we're both at events whenever we possibly can be, but collaboration for Colorado will be key. We also have a state effort, which I am the chair for the State Complete Count Committee, and that particular committee focuses on the different ways that we can reach out to Colorado communities, specifically outside of the Front Range. We have a lot of focus in the Front Range already, and I'll talk a little bit about that with the local aspect. So each of our different counties and municipalities are doing things across the state, but really we needed to find that trusted voice in those communities. And so you'll see the fourth piece down there talking about community, and that's really finding the individuals outside of state and government agencies that individuals trust to really deliver this message. And that ranges anywhere from a local teacher to a pastor to anyone in the community that they really can relate to. And so our effort in Colorado has really continuously been to include that four-part collaboration to make sure that we're successful in our outreach. The state's role, we have a kind of a four-part series that we're looking at. Obviously, we want to make sure we're collaborating and getting the support of the Census Bureau. We really have tried to push the aspects of it's important, it's easy, and it's safe are the three pieces that the state has been pushing to local communities, to local complete count committees, and also from the state perspective. We feel that those three components are really what will resonate well with the communities across Colorado. We also, because our state, and I'm not sure how many are aware of this, but our state is a local control state. So just because the state says do something does not necessarily mean that everybody is on board. So when we have 64 different counties, we really want to rely on the county aspect and the local control to allow for them to do things that impact their community or organizations that work well for their population. We also want to leverage those ideas. So the State Complete Count Committee is really the resource that puts out the messaging statewide, but local communities will be able to translate that information, and you guys will have access to that information that we've created through some of the archives that will be placed online. But there are certain documents that we've put together that we found through stakeholder working groups and actually community events that have common questions that individuals have been asking about the census. One, I talked to a large group of civically engaged individuals through a outreach effort, and about 30% of them did not fill out their census, not because they didn't want to, they didn't realize the impact that it had on the state. And so it's those individuals that we really want to reach. We also have the State Complete Count campaign, which is also known as a committee. That committee was formed through executive order. We started the work back in 2018 to really make sure that we had a solid group of individuals that could understand and represent the state as a whole. Now we have 36 people that sit on that committee, and they range anywhere from Cortez, Colorado, all the way up to Sterling. So we want to make sure that those individuals are really the people that can understand how Colorado needs to be counted, how do we get that messaging out, and how the funding really will impact the state. A couple of things that I want to point out for Colorado, specific with the campaign, is that we just ended our legislative session, and in that session there was a bill that passed for census funding. And that funding allows for a $6 million grant program to be run out of my organization at Department of Local Affairs to fund outreach efforts for nonprofits, local governments, school districts, Ute, Mountain Ute, Southern Ute tribes, as well as intergovernmental agencies to really make sure that they have the dollars to be able to do true outreach. The original conversation was, well, how do we do the outreach for free? Well, now they don't have to. The grant program will roll out. We get the funding appropriated to our state budget on July 1st of 2019. The grant program works as such where we have a committee that advises my executive director on who they believe out of the application process should receive the funding for the grant dollars. They have to show that they will be able to reach hard-to-count populations and that they have a statewide focus. So we're not just looking for organizations that can do things just in Denver, just in Aurora. We're really looking for organizations that have a statewide reach. That grant program will be announced no later than August 15th of 2019, and grants must be awarded by November 1st, 2019 for outreach to begin. So that's a pretty robust timeline, but we're very confident that we'll be able to do it. We're putting together policies and procedures within our agency to ensure that the funding is out the door as it's supposed to. The other methodology of funding that we had an opportunity through a decision item to request funding from state legislature for an additional $300,000 of funding to our department at the Local Affairs Department, to where we can print off and put together marketing materials for organizations that may or may not want to utilize that additional $6 million. There might be groups that apply for both the $6 million and ask for funding or ask for dollars from the $300,000. That $300,000 is used from the Department of Local Affairs, specifically in the State Demography Office, to put together swag and informational materials that can be passed out and handed out at local events. In addition to the State Complete Count Committee, the state's role also is to work with our local Complete Count committees. So far, we have 14 that have been formed across the state as of today. I'll name a couple. We have some regional efforts that have really been focused on. So El Paso County, Teller, and Colorado Springs have decided to do what's called Pikes Peak Complete Count Committee that focuses on those counties and that area. Denver has their own Complete Count Committee. You have an Aurora Complete Count Committee that formed but has their first meeting on July 19th. You also have areas such as Montezuma County as well as Mesa County, which is looking at doing a regional effort. And then the town of Fruita is also looking at hosting and holding their own Complete Count Committee, and that's just to name a few that we've got so far. In our State Complete Count Committee, we found that there's a necessity for us to form subcommittees which focus on specific issues across the state. Obviously, all of these are focusing on the hard-to-count population, so you'll notice that we've broken up some of the stereotypical, stigmatized, hard-to-count populations into what we call subcommittees. Specifics, the first group we have is education and youth. What we found is that people that are under the age of 5 get missed for varying reasons. We have a very dynamic and diverse way of households out in Colorado. You've got multi-parental households. You've got a mom in one household, dad in another household. Mom might think that dad counted the baby, and dad might think the same. That's sometimes how kids get left out. It's not that we forget to count our children, it's that we think someone else might have done it for us. So we are looking at our Education and Youth Subcommittee to focus on anyone pre-K and then also under 5, all the way through 12th grade. We then have a Higher Education Subcommittee that will focus on all of what's counted in group quarters, specifically all of our universities, state colleges, and community colleges. We also have a Policy Subcommittee, which is part of the bill that came out that I just talked about with the $6 million. This Policy Subcommittee were individuals that worked on that particular bill to make sure that that got through into legislature. We also have a Business and Nonprofit Subcommittee, which focuses on the business needs and aspects. And on some of the materials that you guys will see, you'll see that we've actually created a one-pager on how businesses and nonprofits specifically can get involved. That's been a question that we've received when we do events on a regular basis, is how do we get involved as a business? One of the thoughts that we've had is that we can actually go out to businesses because they all have employees, and when they have their all-staff meetings, we can talk to all staff about the census because they are also individuals that we want to have fill out the census. Nonprofits can be utilized to not only get outreach done, but also to work with as the trusted voice in the community. We found that nonprofits are very trusted. We also have a Communication and Media Subcommittee that focuses on tactics in which each of these subcommittees can utilize to get messaging out. One of the things that I would just point out is that some states that have contacted me, as well as some localities within Colorado as well, is how do we get the message? How do we tell people what we want to talk about? Our Communication and Media Subcommittee really focuses on tactics in which you can get information out to folks. So one of the things that we've talked about with them is we could potentially have a text messaging campaign. We know that youth, specifically in hard-to-count communities, might be the ones that are helping their parents or grandparents fill out the census. And so if we can have them engage through a text messaging campaign, and I'll talk a little bit about how we potentially could do that, that would be great for them to get information and provide it to their parents, especially when we have English as a second language in the home. The kids are the ones that are actually going to be able to get information to their parents. Another tactic that we're looking at from the Communication Subcommittee is that we will, as we're out at events, we get questions from the public all of the time about varying issues. Why do they care about my race? Why does race matter? Why is the citizenship question on there? Why does my citizenship question matter? Each of those questions have helped with the development of fact sheets, which you guys will find in the archives, that talk, and those are really driven from the public. These are questions that we get all of the time regarding the census from the general public. And so from that, we then create fact sheets through the subcommittee as well as through the State Complete Count Committee and with our Demography office to develop messaging that resonates well with the community. Our next subcommittee is the Rural Subcommittee. As many of you may or may not know, Colorado's makeup is very rural. Outside of the Front Range, we have a large rural population and a large rural group, and so we have to figure out how we're going to target those individuals and get the messaging to rural Colorado. A lot of people are very excited about the 3 different methodologies in which you can fill out the census this year, but broadband is an issue, and we acknowledge that in Colorado, and it's probably an issue in a lot of other rural states as well. Is how do we get people in rural communities to fill out the census if they don't have connectivity? If they don't have access to a cell phone, if they don't have access to a computer, how are we getting them there? And so we in Colorado have talked about creating assistance centers in our libraries because libraries are a trusted source. Most communities have a library. So they can go and actually we will be providing computers at the libraries to set up and have individuals in rural parts of Colorado and people that might be homeless and people that might not have access to the computer can actually go into the libraries and fill out their census together. And so that kind of creates that sense of community, but reinforces that local control aspect from Colorado as to how we can bring people together. We also broke out the hard to count into another group called Immigrant, Refugee, and People of Color. And so that subcommittee is really focusing on various aspects. We have a large refugee community in Colorado. We have a large immigrant population in Colorado, and they're very targeted areas of Colorado as well. The census is releasing the actual form in 13 different languages, but Colorado has over 400 languages that are spoken in the state. And so we're looking at translation services for those particular communities, making sure that there are people that are a trusted voice for those communities to talk to them about the importance of the census. In the people of color group, you also find that there's a large distrust in government. And so being able to talk to those organizations and those groups in a trusted manner, whether it be through church, whether it's through a library, whether it's through an outreach event that they have that focuses on their community, we are definitely working with different groups in different ways to reach all three of those particular groups within that subcommittee. And finally, we have the local and state government subcommittee, and that is utilizing state government and local government to get messaging out. And so they will take all of the messaging from the State Complete Count Committee and take it to the local committees to be able to pass along the messages moving forward. With each subcommittee, they have several different things that I've tasked them with, which I'm sure they're very excited about. Everyone's had to create an action plan. All of our subcommittees have an action plan that have been put together that focuses on 1 to 2 things that they need to do before the census happens and while the census is out there. So they have to come up with an objective, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that we came up with for tactics. They also have to talk about their strategic partners, and so this really is helpful for us because we find a lot of overlap in different subcommittees. One group may think it's really wonderful to reach out to a school district. Well, if the education subcommittee is already doing that, do we need to have those subcommittees working together to get that messaging out? They also want to look at what resources are necessary. So money was one of the things that we had talked about on a regular basis. That still is something that we'll continue to focus on. And then we also look at what barriers we're facing, and this is all in their action plans. They have to talk about the types of barriers that they've come across, the pushback they're receiving, and I will tell you, for us, we don't get as many questions about why is the census important. We're getting specific questions about why certain questions are on the census. Why does this matter if all we really are looking to do is figure out how many people are here? We created a fact sheet on the citizenship question. A lot of people don't like to talk about that, but I will. One of the things that we focus on is, as it sits right now, the citizenship question is on the census, and until something changes, it will be on there. So we're talking to communities about how that impacts the response for their group. So you guys will find in the resources that I provided that citizenship question fact sheet, and it's the way that we've been talking about it. We're open about it. We're transparent. I get pushback often, and it's something that I continue to add to the fact sheet. The fact sheet changes. It's in a PDF form, but that's one question we've been getting a lot. Another question we get is, well, what does it matter to me if we have a full and accurate count for Colorado? How does that impact me as a person? And so we're really looking at telling the stories of how it impacts the child in your home and their educational funding. If you're looking at your kid and you're saying, why is the educational gap happening in my community? Where's the money going? We can talk about those things. We also talk about the transportation. In Colorado, because we have had a large population growth, and I'm sure a lot of people on the East Coast can relate to this as well, we need funding to make sure that our infrastructure is put together well. If we don't have those things happening, that impacts each and every single person as they drive to work every day or as they're taking their child to school. So we're getting those personal stories to really be able to tell people, why me? Why does it matter that I'm filling this out? And I think that that's one thing that I just want to point out to you all is something that's been coming to us is, what does it matter if I get counted or not? It matters. That's how we came up with our slogan of, in Colorado, everyone counts. The one thing I would caution people against, we thought the messaging was really great, and then we recognized that counts does not translate in the Spanish language as matters very well, so we had to change some of our messaging for the Spanish population to translate into everyone matters versus everyone counts as 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's one thing I just would say, be careful with barriers that you could potentially face, is does everything translate as well as you think it does? Each of the subcommittees also have to focus on low-income populations within their groups. Every subcommittee has been tasked with that because low income does not have a color. It always has a demographic. And so rural Colorado has low-income people, high schools have low-income people. So all of those subcommittees have been tasked with also focusing on low income to make sure we get information out. Some of the tactics that we're doing moving forward, we're looking at creating a Census One book to put in the 2019-2020 school year curriculum. So that will come, the Department of Education is on our State Complete Count Committee, and that subcommittee will also put that into the curriculum base for all school districts as a resource. We're looking at putting things in back to school night handouts. That's a good way for us to get to kids and parents in each of the households. I talked about the assistance centers at the libraries. We'll be looking at having library outreach. We'll also be doing the text messaging campaign if we can come up with the proper language of how we should utilize it. And we'll also be utilizing town halls to have conversations. That's where people talk about government things that they don't necessarily care for at the time. So we will be at most of the community town halls, and we'll hold them sort of as hearings to have an open discussion about census and why are these things happening. One of the other things that I thought was kind of cool that we'll be doing is in the school districts, each of the local communities that have a local complete count committee needs a logo. And so the logos, we're going to have a contest in the elementary schools, for elementary and middle schools, to create a logo for their local complete count committee, and whatever school or class wins that particular drawing and they make the best logo, we'll have some sort of cool thing where maybe they can come down and visit the Capitol for a day or meet their county commissioner or something like that to civically engage the kids, but also be able to say, hey, Mom and Dad, I created that. This is a mock-up of our website. We launched this website earlier this year, and all of the information is up to date, and we update it pretty much every single day. We have FAQs, we have jobs for the census. It's important that with these census jobs, although they are federal jobs, it is important that the right people get these jobs in the local communities. You want people that look like their community, that talk like their community. You don't want someone coming up to your door that you're not comfortable with. So we're definitely making sure that those things are happening. We also have our fact sheets on here, and we also have resources, and all of our meeting notes from our Complete Count Committee are on the website. And these are just some ways that you can support the census efforts. I gave you our website earlier. Also, sharing your information, sharing the census information with your colleagues and friends. We always inform everybody about any meetings that go on. We have a statewide calendar that focuses on all statewide events, so it's a little bit busy, but it has every statewide event that people could potentially be at, and does it make sense for us to go with census messaging, even if it's 5 to 10 minutes to talk about it. We want to make sure that people hear us often. I want people to be so sick of hearing about the census that they're like, fine, I'll just fill it out so you can stop talking about it. So we want that impact. We want to have people knowing about why the census is important. We also want people to identify strategies to help out. And then any information, we're always providing additional resources. You're encouraged to contact my office with any questions or concerns. This is just my contact information, the census website that I talked to you about. We also have our state demography office. Adam Bickford works in that office, and he is the one that does all the updates to those individual fact sheets. So if you find things that you'd like to have added to those, you can always contact him, and he'll get the information put together. In addition, if you're looking at forming a local complete count committee, we encourage you to contact Lily Griego. She is with the Census Bureau. She's a wonderful person, and she can also help you figure out how to set up your local complete count committees, make sure that they're effective and impactful in your community. Any questions?
Well, that was just great, Natrice. Thank you very much. And could you and Trent and Christy all imagine that everybody at their desks is applauding for you now? Yeah, this is the applaud time. We do have some questions, but I want to go to a couple of other slides first, and we can take more questions than what we've got. Two things I want to mention from NCSL. We do have the big meeting of the year in Nashville, August 5th to the 8th. During that, we have lots of good programming on every possible topic, including the census. And then we are also preparing for a meeting in June on redistricting, getting ready to redistrict. It's 2.5 days on redistricting, and you can easily imagine that there will be a census component to that as well. Okay, now we're going to try to get through some of the questions. We had a question about whether Trent's tool is available. It is not publicly available. He's put his information in the chat box if you want to be in touch with him on how to use it. And I'm guessing Trent would be willing to also assist if you're having any difficulties using Roam. Trent, can you confirm that you would be willing to help on that?
Sure, it's really easy, but I will be kind with help, yes.
Okay, great, thank you. Bob asked about the status of the citizenship question. As Natrice said, it is, at this moment, intended to be on the census. I don't believe they've printed the forms yet because the U.S. Supreme Court has heard a case about it and will make their decision by the end of June. And the second part of that was, what do we expect in terms of turnout? I believe the Census Bureau has estimated that there would be a reduction of 6.8 million people based on that. And in terms of outreach, I think you double down on the kinds of things Natrice has been suggesting. Natrice, do you want to say anything more about how you respond when people have a concern about the citizenship question? You kind of addressed it, but let's go further.
Yeah, so whenever I get questions about the citizenship question, I answered exactly as you have, that as it sits right now, it will be on there. But I also talk to people about what does that mean for them. Obviously, we talk about the safety and security of the census form and the census data. People don't know that this information is only shared in aggregate every 72 years. So 72 years from now, I don't know if I'll still be around, but I doubt it based on my current age. So I think that that's one thing that I constantly point out to people is this information is not shared. It's actually illegal to share it with any other agency. And I know that people have this fear that potentially ICE could come knocking at their door or something like that. It is illegal to share this information with any other organization. And the census folks take that very seriously. They're under oath for the remainder of their lives. It's not just for the time that they work with the census. And so that data, although the citizenship question is on there, it actually could potentially help with identifying where we have certain tiered funding for education, and it's not used to figure out if anybody should be visited by a different agency.
All right, and then the next question was about if we do the outreach at the state level, what about the community level? And I think in a sense, Natrice, you addressed that pretty nicely in your comments, but I will say that the way I'm picturing the state level complete count committees is that they are a coordinating place, not where they actually deliver the information. Just like the federal government can't get its message to every corner, the state complete count committees also can't get their information to every corner. So they work with local groups, and those aren't just the county and the city. That includes the churches and the schools and any other kind of community-based organizations. And we've been hearing that what we need are the trusted messengers. Those are the people who are in fact trusted in their communities, and state legislators are trusted by one set of people, teachers are trusted by a different set of people, pastors are trusted by yet another set of people. So the trick is to get to the people who are the trusted messengers. I'd like to hear from you, Natrice. Will your communication plan be online? Someone's asking for it.
Yes, it will be. We are finalizing the last little bits of the communication plan. In addition, the action plans from each of the subcommittees will also be posted on the website. They should be up within the next week or so. Okay,
that's really cool. And do you have money that you're doing media campaigns with?
As of right now, no. We have the $300,000 for the decision item. We are able to use some of that money for media if we want to. We also have the ability to have organizations utilize some of the $6 million for media if they would like. Part of what the state's Complete Count Committee is doing is providing that baseline of messaging to each of these organizations so they can make localized messages. We're also looking at potentially purchasing a PSA campaign where it can go out to various organizations, media outlets throughout the state via TV and radio. And then we're also pitching all of our news outlets to make sure that the messaging gets out on a regular and consistent basis.
I'm also thinking that the word media here sometimes means big media, but it probably means small media for those groups to be able to print flyers in their own community, so it doesn't have to be big.
That's right. And we also have social media, too. So we use social media as well, which doesn't cost us anything at this point.
Okay, and this question might be for you, Trent. I'm not really sure. It comes from Christopher. One thing we are worried about in Massachusetts is that although we are considered an urban state, 40% of the population lives in rural areas, and in the 4 counties of western Massachusetts, more than half of the 101 cities or towns have no broadband internet access. Are there resources out there for parts of states that don't really fit into the hard-to-count definition, but will definitely be hard to reach? Trent, can you take that?
There's definitely state by state, and there's some national level publicly available data showing the kind of precisely where your broadband subscriptions are. So that would be a good starting point, because to your point, it may not hit the 73% threshold that it may pose a barrier. So
this might be a good example of the people in the state know a great deal about what works and what doesn't within it, and whether or not you reach the level that you're officially called hard to count by the federal government may not matter. You'll know what to do in Massachusetts for the folks that you're trying to reach. Our next question, I'm not sure who this might be for. It's from Michelle. She asks, is there anything you'd suggest for funders to do aside from contributing to pooled funds? So I'm having a hard time thinking about what else funders can do besides provide the fund. Oh, Natrice has this. Great.
I have a simple statement, I guess, that I can say for this. So in Colorado, we actually pulled together some of our rural funders network to talk about ways in which they can do things outside of just giving money. We're looking at the foundations as specific targeted groups that can actually do outreach for us. It's not that we're just looking at their money. We're actually bringing all of the major foundations together to have conversations about the census so that we can develop targeted messaging. I think another component, there are actually foundations that are coming together. I think there's about 13 states that have national foundations that are coming together to figure out ways in which they can do outreach for census. I got an article about it earlier today that I haven't had a chance to read, but each of the foundations are actually interested in wanting to fund some component of the census, but from our perspective, one thing that we're doing is looking at them as a resource to be an audience captivator to get the information out because they have such a deep reach into communities. For example, El Pomar in Colorado has a huge reach in Colorado, but specifically in Colorado Springs because that's where they're located. And so we utilize them to help with messaging to get it out to their population, their funders, their directors, things like that, to make sure that they're helping with the message because they are also what we consider a trusted voice.
I noticed down below that Edward Bryant has just popped in saying, we've formed a funders group that includes foundations and are hosting a convening this month. So it could be that Edward needs to get in touch with the person who asked that question, and we can make that happen if we need to. Another question for you, Natrice. Is it true that you said that students get to create the logo for their local communities?
So from our school districts, we are reaching out to them to have them do that, yes. We thought it would be a good way for them to engage, and then it would also be a very good way for them to say, hey, Mom and Dad, not only is the census important, but my class created that logo. And so that, yes, that is one way that we're looking to engage the local children in the community.
All right, and then William O'Hare asked, does anyone at NCSL have any systematic information about how much state money is distributed on the basis of the census count? Can you take that, Christy?
Yeah, currently, I mean, we do have the information from Andrew Reamer for that information, and it's on our website. It's linked on our website for that information.
And if I'm not mistaken, we've heard it said that there could be $1,500 per person per year, and we've heard even numbers higher than that. So that number does exist, and that gives you the ballpark for it. Am I right about that, Christy?
That's correct.
Okay, good, got it. And thank you, Sam, for putting in what you did about the counting for dollars out of GW's Institute of Public Policy. Okay, Dave asks, where's the list of foundations who want to fund outreach campaigns? It looks to me, Edward, if you could send us an email on what you've got, then we might be able to distribute that to other people. And Natrice, you mentioned an article. Are you able to share that with other folks? Or
yes.
Maybe share it with us and we'll share it on.
Yes, I am. I'm actually looking at it right now and reading it. We are able to do that. It talks a little bit about the article, talks about the funding gap of the $10 million that could potentially happen if foundations are not involved. So there's a $10 million gap that they're trying to fill through the philanthropic support to ensure that the gap is made. Also, they're looking at potentially having $5 million to support a national work by the Funder Collaborative, and then also to date they have 90 funders that have supported the census work by contributing what they're able to, anywhere from $15,000 to $5 million. The network is a 17 national hub focused on different communities that are hard to count, and the hub organizations are doing public opinion research to help shape the messaging and also collaborating with state and local officials. And then they also have a census equity fund that's supporting coordinated campaigns by state and local groups with at least 13 states that have large, hard-to-count populations and limited philanthropic outreach.
Great, and that looks like it's the last question from you all, but I would like to ask a question of you all, and that is, if there is new news in your state on the topic of creation of complete count committees or funding for complete count committees, we'd love to know about it, and you've got our emails there for Christy and for me, and that way we will be more up to date. We do have a survey that we'd like to ask you to stay on. It'll just take a minute, but with that, I'm going to thank our presenters again, and thank you all for taking an hour to be with us today on this nice Friday. So with that, I'm going to conclude our webinar. Thank you.